Snow fell over Chicago in thick, silent curtains on the night the wedding of the decade was supposed to take place. Inside a century-old cathedral downtown, more than 300 guests filled every pew, their whispers rising like smoke toward the vaulted ceiling. Business leaders, politicians, and journalists from at least a dozen major outlets had gathered under one roof, drawn not simply by love, but by power, money, and the promise of a story worth telling for years to come. Candles lined the aisle in perfect rows, their flames trembling each time the heavy doors opened to let in another gust of winter air. At the front of the church stood Ethan Carter, 34 years old, the chief executive of Carter Holdings, a real estate empire built across 3 decades by his family name. He looked composed in his tailored black suit, yet something behind his eyes refused to settle, as though a storm far more dangerous than the one outside had already begun inside his chest. Outside, the temperature had dropped low enough to turn the city streets into a sheet of glittering ice. Yet none of the guests seemed to mind, too eager for a glimpse of the union everyone had spent months anticipating. The woman waiting to walk down that aisle was Amara Johnson, 29 years old, an architect whose talent had already earned her quiet respect in an industry that rarely made room for a young black woman from a modest background. She had grown up watching her grandmother sketch buildings on the backs of grocery receipts, dreaming of structures that could change the shape of a city and the lives inside it. Her mother had worked 2 jobs, most of Amara's childhood, and her father had passed away when she was only 16, leaving her grandmother as the steady presence who taught her that ambition was not something to apologize for. On this night, wrapped in a gown of white silk that caught the candlelight like frost, Amara believed she was walking toward the beginning of everything she had ever wanted. She had loved Ethan for 6 years, through late nights, financial struggles, and the slow, patient building of 2 separate careers into one shared future. She trusted him completely, the way only a person who has never been betrayed can trust another human being. In the bridal suite moments before the ceremony, she had laughed with her bridesmaids, adjusted her veil twice, and whispered to her own reflection that she had finally found the life she deserved. She had no way of knowing that trust was about to be shattered in front of every camera in the room. Her closest friend, a woman named Danielle who had known her since architecture school, stood nearby, holding her train, remarking quietly that she had never seen Amara look so completely at peace with any decision in her entire life. Amara had spent the previous night writing vows by candlelight, describing Ethan as the steady ground beneath years of uncertain ambition, words she believed with her whole heart in that fleeting, fragile hour before everything changed. An hour before the ceremony, in a private room adjoining the cathedral, Ethan's phone lit up with a message from a name he had tried for months to forget. Vanessa Blake, his former girlfriend from college, wrote only a handful of words, but they were enough to unravel 5 years of careful decisions in a matter of seconds. She asked to see him one last time before he made a mistake he could never undo. Ethan told himself he would simply meet her, say goodbye, and return to the altar as a man free of old ghosts. He slipped away from his groomsmen under the excuse of needing air, his heart pounding for reasons he refused to name, even to himself. Instead, standing in a quiet hallway lit by a single lamp, he found himself pulled backward into a version of himself he thought he had outgrown. Vanessa reminded him of a life without responsibility, without the quiet steadiness that Amara represented, and somewhere in that conversation, Ethan's resolve began to crumble like ice under warm rain. She told him that she had never stopped loving him, that watching him prepare to marry another woman had broken something inside her she could no longer ignore. And Ethan, weak in that fragile moment, allowed her words to reshape the next 50 years of his life in the span of 10 minutes. When the church doors finally opened, the guests rose to their feet, and Amara stepped into the aisle with her father's memory carried in her heart and her uncle's arm linked through hers, radiant and certain. But instead of standing alone at the altar, Ethan appeared beside Vanessa, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as though she belonged there. A murmur swept through the pews, confusion turning quickly into disbelief, phones quietly rising into the air as certain guests began recording without fully understanding what they were witnessing. Amara stopped walking, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands, searching Ethan's face for some explanation that would make sense of what she was seeing. Ethan opened his mouth, and in front of hundreds of witnesses and the unblinking eyes of the press, he spoke the words that would define the next 5 years of both their lives. "I am sorry," he said, his voice flat and hollow. "I cannot marry you." The cathedral fell into a silence so complete that even the candles seemed to stop flickering, and Amara felt the floor of her entire future disappear beneath her feet. Somewhere behind her, a bridesmaid gasped audibly, and an elderly guest, near the front row, pressed a hand to her chest in genuine shock. Photographers, who had been invited to document a celebration, instead captured the unraveling of one, their cameras clicking rapidly as Amara turned and walked back down the aisle alone, her white gown dragging against the stone floor like a flag of surrender. She did not cry in that moment. Not yet, her body moving on instinct, while her mind refused to process what had just happened. Outside, the snow had grown heavier, and she stepped into it without a coat, without a plan, without the life she had spent years building around one man's promise. Her heels sank into the fresh snow as she walked past the line of luxury cars, waiting to carry guests to a reception that would now never happen, ignoring the shouts of her name from photographers who had followed her outside. Behind her, the cathedral doors closed on a scene that would soon spread across every screen in the country, transformed within hours into a story the whole nation would discuss. Ethan remained frozen at the altar, Vanessa's hand still on his arm, watching the woman he had just humiliated disappear into a storm that mirrored the one he had created. For the first time since making his decision, a flicker of doubt crossed his face, though it arrived far too late to matter. By morning, footage of the abandoned bride had traveled across the entire country, shared and reshared, until Amara's tear-streaked walk through the snow became the single most talked-about moment of that winter. News anchors labeled it the wedding betrayal of the decade, replaying the clip alongside interviews with wedding guests eager to offer their own version of events. Talk shows debated the ethics of public confessions at the altar, while opinion columns questioned whether a man capable of such cruelty deserved the empire he had inherited. Ethan Carter's name, once associated with ambition and success, became synonymous overnight with cruelty and cowardice, his company's stock dipping slightly as speculation about his judgment spread through business circles. Vanessa Blake, meanwhile, found herself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight, photographed outside restaurants and hotels, her every expression scrutinized by strangers who had never met her. Reporters camped outside Amara's apartment building for days, hoping for a statement that never came, because the woman at the center of the story had already vanished from public view entirely. Her employer at the time, a mid-sized architecture firm where she had worked for nearly 6 years, granted her an indefinite leave of absence without hesitation, sensing correctly that she needed far more than a few days to recover from what had happened. Colleagues sent flowers and quiet messages of support, though most respected the silence she had chosen to maintain during those first disorienting weeks. She had boarded a flight to Colorado less than 48 hours after the wedding, carrying only a single suitcase and a heart she no longer recognized as her own. The cabin she arrived at belonged to her late grandmother, tucked into the mountains outside a small town where cell service came and went, like an afterthought. For the first several days, Amara barely moved from the couch, unable to eat more than a few bites at a time, unable to sleep for more than an hour, before waking with her chest tight and her mind replaying the same humiliating scene on a loop. The silence of the mountains, once a comfort during childhood summers, now felt suffocating. Every creak of the old wooden floors, reminding her of a life she could no longer return to. She avoided mirrors, avoided windows, avoided anything that might remind her of the woman she had been standing at that altar, hopeful and naive. Old friends called repeatedly, their voicemails piling up unanswered, because Amara could not yet find the words to explain a pain she barely understood herself. Her mother eventually drove up from the city, bringing groceries and sitting quietly beside her for hours, without demanding conversation, simply offering the presence Amara needed but could not yet ask for. It was on the 6th night, while searching through a dusty box of belongings from her college years, that she found a leather-bound sketchbook filled with drawings from a different version of herself, one who had once dreamed of designing buildings that could reshape entire skylines. Beneath the sketchbook, wrapped in tissue paper, sat an envelope with her name, written in her grandmother's unmistakable handwriting. Amara sat on the cabin floor for a long while before opening it, almost afraid of what truths it might contain. Inside, her grandmother had written a letter meant to be read only after her passing, filled with memories, advice, and one line that struck Amara harder than anything else in the entire letter. "Do not let a man decide your worth," her grandmother had written, "because worth is something you build with your own two hands, brick by brick, long before any man ever arrives to admire it." The letter continued, describing her grandmother's own early struggles as a young woman denied opportunities because of the color of her skin, and how she had learned to measure her value by her own standards rather than by the approval of others. Amara read those words again and again, tears finally breaking free after days of numbness, releasing something that had been trapped inside her chest since the moment the cathedral doors had closed behind her. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that she had spent 6 years quietly shrinking her own ambitions to fit neatly beside Ethan's, postponing her own dreams in favor of building a life around his. That letter did not erase her pain, but it planted a small, stubborn seed of resolve that would slowly grow into something far stronger than heartbreak, a seed that would take root over the following months and eventually reshape the entire direction of her life. In the weeks that followed, Amara made a decision that surprised even herself, choosing to attend an international architecture conference in Toronto rather than continue hiding from the world. She arrived nervous, still carrying the weight of public humiliation, uncertain whether anyone in that room would see her as anything other than the woman from the viral video. Backstage, moments before her scheduled presentation, she nearly walked away entirely, her hands shaking as she clutched her notes, until a stranger offered her a simple word of encouragement that steadied her enough to walk onto the stage. Yet when she stood to present her thesis project from years earlier, reworked and refined during sleepless nights in the cabin, something shifted in the atmosphere of the auditorium. Her ideas about sustainable urban housing, designed to serve communities long overlooked by traditional developers, captured the attention of architects and investors alike, drawing a wave of applause far louder than she had anticipated. Among the audience sat Margaret Sinclair, a billionaire philanthropist known throughout the industry for discovering talent long before the rest of the world caught up. Margaret approached Amara after the presentation, offering not just praise but an opportunity that would alter the entire trajectory of her career, a chance to build something entirely her own, backed by resources she had never dared imagine possessing. Over coffee the following morning, Margaret spoke candidly about her own early failures in business, reminding Amara that reinvention was not a sign of weakness, but often the very foundation of greatness. Before leaving Colorado, Amara spent one final week walking the mountain trails she had once explored as a child, allowing herself to grieve fully rather than carry unfinished sorrow across an ocean. She visited her grandmother's grave one last time, kneeling in the snow to say aloud the promise she intended to keep for the rest of her life, that she would never again allow another person to determine the shape of her future. Her mother drove her to the airport, holding her hand tightly at the gate, reminding her that courage rarely feels comfortable in the moment it is required. Amara boarded the plane with nothing but 2 suitcases, a modest savings account, and the letter from her grandmother tucked carefully into her carry-on bag. Somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, watching the dark water stretch endlessly below the wing, she allowed herself to imagine, for the first time since the wedding, a future that belonged entirely to her. Within months, Amara made the difficult choice to leave the United States entirely, relocating to London to establish her own architecture firm, under the name Johnson Urban Design. The early years were far from glamorous, filled with rejected proposals, skeptical investors, and long nights spent convincing skeptical clients that a young designer with an unconventional vision deserved their trust. She worked out of a small rented office above a bakery, often surviving on little more than tea and determination, refusing every offer to return home despite the loneliness that crept in during the darkest winter evenings. The bakery owner, an elderly woman named Patricia, often left warm bread outside Amara's door. On nights, she noticed the office lights still burning past midnight, a small kindness that Amara never forgot, even years after her company outgrew that tiny office space. She hired her first employee, a recent graduate eager for a chance no larger firm would offer him, teaching herself how to manage payroll and client contracts through trial and repeated error. She slept little, ate less, and questioned her decision more times than she could count, yet she refused to return to the life that had discarded her so publicly. Her first major project, a mixed-use community center in a struggling neighborhood, succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, drawing attention from developers across Europe eager to replicate her approach. The local council that had initially hesitated to approve her unconventional design later invited her to speak at a public celebration marking the center's opening, where residents thanked her personally for creating a space that finally reflected the character of their community rather than the profit-driven instincts of outside investors. That single afternoon, standing among children, playing in a courtyard she had designed from a blank sheet of paper, gave Amara a sense of purpose that no relationship had ever provided her. From there, opportunities multiplied rapidly, taking her firm into Dubai, then Singapore, then Copenhagen. Each project building upon the reputation she had fought so hard to establish, each city adding another layer to the confidence she had once nearly lost entirely. While Amara rebuilt her life brick by brick, an ocean away, Ethan and Vanessa settled into a relationship defined by extravagance, expensive vacations, exclusive parties, and a constant hunger for attention that neither of them seemed capable of satisfying. Ethan had convinced himself, in the immediate aftermath of the wedding scandal, that Vanessa represented a simpler kind of love, one without the quiet expectations he had felt from Amara to grow, to reflect, to become a better version of himself. In truth, Vanessa asked nothing of him beyond his generosity, and for a while, that absence of expectation felt like relief rather than warning. They moved into a penthouse overlooking the same lake Ethan had once dreamed of raising a family beside, filling its rooms with expensive art and furniture, chosen more for appearance than comfort. Photographs of their lifestyle occasionally appeared in society pages, curated carefully to project happiness. Neither of them entirely felt once the cameras turned away. As the months turned into years, cracks began forming beneath the surface of Ethan's new life, cracks he was too distracted to notice at first. Vanessa cared little for the responsibilities that came with running a company, more interested in status and spending than in strategy or long-term vision, often disappearing for weeks at a time, on trips funded entirely by Ethan's accounts. Carter Holdings, once a symbol of steady growth, began losing ground to competitors offering more innovative designs and forward-thinking approaches to urban development. Board meetings grew tense, longtime partners quietly withdrew their investments, and whispers began circulating that the company's golden era had ended the same winter. Its founder had made international headlines for the wrong reasons. Ethan found himself increasingly isolated in boardrooms, his decisions questioned by investors who had once trusted his judgment without hesitation. Late one evening, during a private dinner meant to secure a struggling partnership, one investor casually mentioned a name that made Ethan's chest tighten with an emotion he could not immediately identify. "Have you heard," the investor asked, "that Amara Johnson was just named one of the most influential architects under 40 by a major business publication?" Ethan forced a smile and changed the subject, but the question lingered in his mind for weeks afterward, refusing to fade, resurfacing every time he closed his eyes at night. 5 years after that snow-covered wedding, the world Amara Johnson now inhabited bore little resemblance to the one she had fled in humiliation. Johnson Urban Design had grown into a global firm valued at several $billion, with offices spanning 4 continents and a client list that included governments, universities, and Fortune 500 corporations. She had become a sought-after speaker at international summits, her insights on sustainable design shaping conversations far beyond the architecture industry itself, quoted in publications that once would never have considered covering her work. Universities that had once rejected her scholarship applications now competed to award her honorary degrees, eager to associate their names with her success, sending letters filled with praise she read with a quiet, private satisfaction. Meanwhile, Carter Holdings continued its slow decline, weighed down by outdated strategies and a leadership team that had grown complacent during years of inherited success. Several senior executives who had worked alongside Ethan's late father chose early retirement rather than adapt to markets shifting faster than the company's traditional methods could accommodate, leaving critical leadership gaps that younger hires struggled to fill. Trade publications that once praised Carter Holdings as an industry innovator now published cautious assessments, questioning whether the company could survive another decade without significant restructuring. When Chicago announced plans for its most ambitious redevelopment project in decades, a project Carter Holdings desperately needed to win, the bidding process brought two familiar names back into direct competition for the very first time. Executives on both sides understood immediately the significance of the moment, though few dared to say aloud what everyone in the industry was already quietly thinking. Reporters who had once covered the scandal of the abandoned wedding began quietly reaching out to sources on both sides, sensing that a far more compelling story was about to unfold in the heart of the very city where it had all begun. Inside Carter Holdings, junior staff members whispered nervously about the irony of the situation, wondering privately whether their chief executive fully understood what awaited him in the coming weeks. Amara, for her part, approached the opportunity with the same discipline she applied to every project, refusing to allow personal history to distract her team from delivering their strongest possible proposal. Johnson Urban Design submitted a proposal so far superior in vision and sustainability that the selection committee awarded them the contract without hesitation, forcing Amara to return to the city she had once left in disgrace. News of her victory spread quickly through Chicago's business community, and during a routine briefing at Carter Holdings, Ethan watched her name appear across a conference screen alongside details of the winning design. For a long moment, he simply stared at the photograph, accompanying the announcement, struggling to reconcile the confident, composed woman in the image with the devastated bride he remembered from 5 years earlier. Something inside him, long buried beneath ambition and denial, stirred uncomfortably at the sight of her success. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the life he had chosen instead of her had brought him neither the happiness nor the fulfillment he once believed it would. That night, alone in his penthouse, overlooking the very lake he had once promised to build a life beside, he poured himself a drink he never touched, staring instead at old photographs he had never quite managed to delete. That realization arrived quietly, without fanfare, yet it would prove impossible to ignore in the weeks that followed. Chicago welcomed Amara back beneath another heavy snowfall, as though the city itself remembered the night she had left it behind. She stepped out of a black car outside the very building, where the redevelopment negotiations would take place, dressed in a tailored coat that radiated the quiet authority of someone who no longer needed anyone's approval. Reporters gathered at a respectful distance, eager for comments about her triumphant return, though she offered them little beyond a polite smile and a brief statement about her excitement for the project ahead. Inside the building, Ethan caught sight of her from across the lobby, and, for a brief moment, failed to recognize the woman standing there at all. Gone was the uncertain hopefulness he remembered from their wedding day, replaced by a poise that commanded attention without demanding it, a stillness in her posture that suggested she had long since stopped needing anyone's validation. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and neither of them said a single word, the silence between them heavier than anything either could have expressed aloud. He noticed, with a strange ache, that she did not flinch or look away first, that whatever power he once held over her had quietly and completely disappeared. Throughout the formal proceedings that followed, Ethan found himself studying her mannerisms from across the conference table, the deliberate way she paused before answering difficult questions, the calm authority with which she addressed skeptical board members twice her age. Colleagues who had worked alongside her for years later described that meeting as the moment Johnson Urban Design fully cemented its reputation within the Chicago business community, a reputation built entirely without any assistance from the Carter family name. During the reception that followed the signing ceremony, a prominent businessman named Alexander Hayes approached Amara with genuine warmth, clearly captivated by both her intellect and her presence. Their conversation flowed easily, filled with laughter and shared perspectives on urban development, drawing the attention of several guests who noticed the natural chemistry between them. Alexander, who had built his own fortune in sustainable energy rather than inherited wealth, admired the way Amara spoke about her failures as openly as her achievements, a rare quality among the guarded executives who typically filled such rooms. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had followed her career for years, quietly impressed long before their paths ever crossed in person. Alexander asked thoughtful questions about her design philosophy, listening intently rather than waiting for his turn to speak, a quality Amara had rarely encountered among the powerful men she had met throughout her career. Ethan watched from across the room, unable to look away, a strange and unfamiliar ache settling into his chest as he observed the ease with which Amara connected with someone else entirely. For years, he had told himself that walking away from her had been a difficult but necessary decision, yet standing there, watching her thrive without him, he understood for the first time exactly what he had thrown away. The realization hit him with a force he had not anticipated, stripping away the careful justifications he had constructed over 5 long years. Before the evening ended, driven by an impulse he could not fully explain, Ethan approached Amara privately and asked if she would be willing to speak with him alone, just once, before she returned to London. They met the following evening in a quiet hotel lounge, overlooking the frozen expanse of Lake Michigan, the city lights scattered like stars across the dark water below. Ethan arrived first, rehearsing words that felt inadequate, no matter how he arranged them, painfully aware of how little an apology could repair after so many years. He had chosen the location deliberately, remembering it as a place they had once visited together during happier days, though he wondered now whether the memory meant anything to her at all. When Amara arrived, she carried herself with the same calm confidence she had displayed throughout her return to Chicago, betraying none of the nervousness he half expected to see. Ethan began speaking almost immediately, admitting that he had made the worst mistake of his life on their wedding day, a mistake compounded by every year he had spent avoiding the truth of what he had done. He confessed that Vanessa had never brought him the happiness he anticipated, and that watching Amara's success over the years had forced him to confront a level of regret he had never previously allowed himself to feel. He admitted that he had followed her career quietly from a distance, reading every article and press release, never quite finding the courage to reach out until circumstance had finally forced their paths back together. He told her that he understood he had no right to expect forgiveness, and that he had not come to ask for it, only to finally say aloud what he had carried silently for far too long. Amara listened without interrupting, her expression steady, neither softened by sympathy nor hardened by resentment, her hands folded calmly around a cup of tea she had barely touched. When Ethan finally finished speaking, Amara remained quiet for a long moment before responding, her voice calm and measured rather than bitter. She told him that on the day he left her standing at that altar, she genuinely believed her life had ended, that nothing good could possibly follow such public humiliation. But she explained that in the years since, she had come to understand that moment differently, recognizing it now as the beginning of everything meaningful that had happened afterward. She spoke of the cabin in Colorado, the letter from her grandmother, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding herself from nothing into someone she finally respected. She described the nights in London when she had nearly given up entirely, when rejection letters piled higher than commissions, and she questioned whether leaving her old life behind had been wisdom or simply wounded pride, disguised as ambition. She told him that every single one of those difficult years had ultimately mattered more to her sense of self than anything the 6 years they spent together ever had. She did not raise her voice, did not shed a single tear, and offered no forgiveness wrapped in anger, only a quiet clarity that seemed to unsettle Ethan more than any accusation could have. He sat across from her, unable to find a response adequate to match the grace with which she had just dismantled 5 years of guilt he had carried in silence. As their conversation drew to a close, neither of them noticed Vanessa standing just beyond the lounge entrance, having followed Ethan there out of a suspicion she could no longer ignore. Vanessa had overheard enough of the conversation to understand that Ethan's feelings toward his former fiancée remained far more complicated than he had ever admitted to her directly. Rather than confronting him immediately, she retreated quietly, her mind already turning toward the secrets she had spent years carefully concealing from him. In the days that followed, strange inconsistencies within Carter Holdings began surfacing, confidential contracts and strategic plans that had somehow reached the hands of the company's fiercest competitors. Ethan launched a discreet internal investigation, refusing to believe what the evidence increasingly suggested, until the truth became impossible to deny any longer. Financial records revealed a pattern of transfers to offshore accounts linked to a competing firm, transfers that traced directly back to a device registered under Vanessa's name. The company's legal team advised Ethan to proceed carefully, warning that any public disclosure could reignite media attention neither the company nor Ethan personally could afford to invite back into their lives. Still, Ethan insisted on confronting Vanessa privately before deciding on any formal legal action, needing to hear the truth directly from the woman he had once believed loved him unconditionally. Ethan confronted her directly, demanding an explanation for years of betrayal hidden beneath affection, and Vanessa offered no apology, no denial, only a confession delivered with startling indifference. She admitted plainly that she had never loved him, not during their college years and not during the 5 years they had spent together since his broken engagement. What she had loved, she told him coldly, was the access his name provided, the parties, the influence, and the financial security that came attached to the Carter family fortune. She explained, almost casually, that she had begun selling information to a rival developer years earlier. Using the proceeds to fund a lifestyle Ethan had unknowingly financed twice over. Ethan felt something inside him finally break completely, not from heartbreak this time, but from the devastating realization that he had sacrificed his entire future for a woman who had never valued him beyond his usefulness. He thought back to the countless nights he had chosen Vanessa's company over reconciling with his own guilt, the anniversaries he had spent, celebrating a relationship built on manipulation rather than genuine affection, and the family members who had quietly distanced themselves from him after witnessing the choice he made that winter. Standing in his office long after Vanessa had left the building for the final time, he understood that the true cost of his betrayal had never been measured in broken contracts or leaked strategies, but in the slow erosion of his own character across 5 wasted years. He ended the relationship immediately, initiating both a personal separation and a legal process to address the damage her betrayal had caused his company. In the weeks that followed, he threw himself into rebuilding Carter Holdings from the ground up, hoping that professional redemption might somehow ease the personal devastation consuming him. Working 18-hour days that left little room for anything beyond spreadsheets and restructuring plans. He replaced much of his executive team, brought in outside consultants to modernize the company's approach to sustainable development, and personally reviewed every major contract before it left the building, determined never again to be blindsided by betrayal, disguised as loyalty. His mother, one of the few family members who still spoke to him regularly, worried aloud during a rare dinner together that he was punishing himself through work rather than genuinely healing from everything that had happened. Ethan brushed off her concern at the time, though her words would return to him many nights later, echoing quietly in the empty rooms of his penthouse. Yet no amount of business success could quiet the persistent thought that the life he truly wanted had already moved permanently beyond his reach. Several weeks later, an invitation arrived at Ethan's office, elegant and unassuming, informing him of an international architecture gala, honoring the most influential designers shaping the future of global cities. Near the top of the program, printed in bold lettering, was Amara Johnson's name, listed as the recipient of that year's most prestigious honor within the industry, an award given to only one architect worldwide each year. Ethan hesitated for days before deciding to attend, uncertain whether his presence would be welcomed or resented, yet unable to resist the pull of seeing her one final time in a setting that reflected everything she had become. The night of the gala, a grand ballroom filled with architects, investors, and dignitaries from around the world gathered to witness the presentation of the Global Visionary Award. chandeliers casting warm golden light across tables set with white linen and fresh winter flowers. When Amara's name was called, she walked onto the stage with the same quiet confidence that had carried her through every difficult year since that snow-covered wedding day, wearing a deep emerald gown that seemed to command the entire room without effort. The applause that greeted her felt different from anything Ethan had ever witnessed, earned rather than inherited, built from genuine respect rather than social obligation. Alexander Hayes, seated near the front, rose immediately to his feet, clapping with obvious pride, while Ethan remained near the back of the room, watching from a distance that felt far greater than the physical space between them. The master of ceremonies read a brief summary of Amara's accomplishments before handing her the microphone, listing projects across 4 continents, and describing her as one of the defining architectural voices of her generation. Several attendees near Ethan exchanged quiet remarks about the wedding scandal from years earlier, unaware that the man responsible for it stood only a few feet away, listening in silence. Standing at the podium, Amara delivered a speech that avoided bitterness entirely, choosing instead to speak about resilience, growth, and the quiet power of rebuilding oneself after devastating loss. She told the audience that failure does not destroy a person, and that betrayal does not define who someone ultimately becomes. Only the manner in which they choose to rise afterward truly shapes their story. She spoke of her grandmother's letter without revealing its full contents, describing instead the enduring lesson that worth must be built by one's own hands rather than borrowed from another person's approval. She thanked her small early team in London for believing in a vision few investors initially took seriously, and she acknowledged Margaret Sinclair by name, calling her the first person outside her family to see potential in her when she herself had struggled to see it at all. She spoke briefly, without naming names, of a night 5 winters earlier when she believed her entire future had collapsed in front of hundreds of strangers, and how that very collapse had ultimately freed her to build something far greater than she had ever originally imagined. Her words carried across the room with a weight that silenced even the most restless attendees, each sentence landing with the clarity of someone who had lived every syllable she spoke. When she finished, the entire ballroom rose to its feet in a standing ovation that lasted for several long minutes, applause echoing off the high ceilings like distant thunder. Margaret Sinclair, seated at a table near the stage, dabbed her eyes with a napkin, visibly proud of the young architect she had discovered years earlier in a crowded conference hall in Toronto. Even the event photographers, usually indifferent to speeches, after years of covering similar ceremonies, paused to capture the moment, sensing correctly that they were witnessing something the industry would remember for years to come. Ethan stood among the crowd, tears sliding down his face without shame, finally understanding the full scope of what he had lost on that winter day 5 years earlier. He realized, watching her accept the recognition she had earned entirely on her own terms, that no apology or gesture could ever restore what his betrayal had cost them both. Yet even in that painful clarity, something within him settled, grateful simply to witness the woman she had become, even from a distance he alone had created. After the ceremony concluded, Ethan found Amara standing near the entrance of the venue, watching snow fall gently outside the tall glass windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. He approached slowly, uncertain what words remained worth saying after everything that had already passed between them. If he could go back, he began quietly, he would choose differently. He would stand at that altar and never let her walk away. Amara turned to face him, her expression soft but unwavering, and told him that neither of them could return to that moment, no matter how deeply either wished otherwise. She said, the only thing that truly mattered now was who he chose to become moving forward, not who he had once failed to be, and that dwelling on a version of the past that could never exist would only prevent him from building something honest going forward. He asked, almost hesitantly, whether she was happy, genuinely happy, after everything she had endured because of his decision years earlier. Amara looked out at the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the window, the same city where she had once collapsed in humiliation and heartbreak. A quiet smile crossed her face, unforced and entirely her own, as she considered the distance she had traveled since that devastating winter night. Very happy, she told him simply, her voice carrying no trace of performance or bitterness, only honest and hard-earned peace. She mentioned, gently, that Alexander had asked to see her again once her business in Chicago concluded, and that for the first time in years she felt genuinely excited about what might come next in her personal life. She spoke of him, not with the breathless certainty she once carried for Ethan, but with a grounded curiosity that felt, to her, far more sustainable than the whirlwind romance of her 20s had ever been. Whatever came of it, she said, she no longer needed another person to complete a life she had already spent 5 years building with her own hands. They shook hands then, a simple gesture that replaced any need for embraces or tearful goodbyes neither of them truly required anymore. There was no lingering anger in that handshake, no unresolved longing disguised as closure, only the quiet dignity of two people who had finally grown beyond the wreckage of their shared past. Ethan turned and walked out into the falling snow alone, finally accepting a truth he could no longer outrun or renegotiate, his coat collar raised against the wind, as he disappeared down a street lined with soft golden lamplight. Amara returned to the ballroom, disappearing into a crowd of admirers and colleagues who saw her not as a woman once abandoned, but as an architect who had reshaped her own destiny entirely on her own terms. In the years that followed, people would often ask, what became of the man who had left his bride standing at the altar during one of the harshest winters Chicago had ever seen? Some would mention Carter Holdings, rebuilt but never quite reaching its former prominence, a company that survived, yet never fully recovered the trust it had once commanded throughout the industry. Others would recall Vanessa Blake, whose name eventually faded from public memory entirely, her ambitions unraveling quietly, in the years following her exposure and departure from Ethan's life. Ethan himself withdrew gradually from public attention, choosing a quieter existence focused on smaller, more meaningful projects rather than the aggressive expansion that had once defined his career. But most conversations would inevitably return to Amara Johnson, the woman whose greatest triumph was never measured by anyone's regret, apology, or belated recognition of her worth. Her greatest revenge, if it could even be called that, was never forcing Ethan to feel sorry for what he had done to her. It was simply becoming a woman so complete, so secure, and so extraordinary in her own right that his regret no longer held any power over how she understood her own value. Years later, students at architecture schools around the world would study her early community projects alongside her later global commissions, learning not only her design philosophy, but the story of resilience woven through every blueprint she ever signed. Young women entering the field often cited her as the reason they refused to abandon their own ambitions after suffering setbacks that once felt insurmountable. The story of that snow-covered wedding day would be remembered by many, retold in interviews and profiles for years afterward, but Amara's true legacy was written not in headlines or viral footage, but in every building she designed, every life she touched, and every version of herself she refused to abandon.